Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's presentation, Do Extraordinary Claims Require Extraordinary Evidence? Provocative question. We're not supposed to run around and be gullible, right? It is the question of the evening. Welcome to everyone who's here and everybody who's online live, or if you're watching this video afterwards, we hope you find it very informative. Once again, this question, do extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? Believing that an invisible creator exists that created everything. Believing that someone who claimed to be the Son of God rose from the dead. Do those extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? Well, Dr. John DePoe is going to unpack this statement this evening. You'll find this objection in many places on the internet. It's a reasonable question to ask, but there's some things that John is going to unpack tonight so we can understand the basis of this question and we know how to answer it. I have a couple announcements here. First, I wanted to say what our upcoming presentations are. We've got the fall semester all planned out. Following this presentation on September 17th, which is a Tuesday, and remember, all the presentations will be here at the Central Campus at 7 p.m. on Tuesday nights, once a month. September 17th, does Christianity make sense? Have you ever wrestled with that question? Some people just don't get it. They say, the Trinity, three people in one, all this people raised from the dead, it doesn't make any sense. And Dr. DePoe is going to unpack that. October 15th, how was the Bible put together? You'll hear that question asked a lot. And there is a claim that the Bible was put together centuries after Jesus, behind closed doors in a smoke-filled room, people deciding what books were going to rule the day. Is that the history, or is there another history that's true? Dr. DePoe is going to unpack that. The short version is that's not what happened. It was different, and it's good news. November 19th, that date will probably change. But is Jesus the only way or only a way? This is the question of religious pluralism. It's very popular in our day to believe that all religions basically say the same thing. Is that true? Is Christianity unique? Does Christianity make an open-ended claim, or is it a particular claim? And finally, right before Christmas, as we ponder the mystery of the Incarnation, Dr. DePoe is going to answer the question, how can Jesus be both God and man? A profound mystery. Seems like a contradiction, but it's not. And he'll unpack that. So when you go home for family dinner and you encounter a loved one in an extended family who's doubting, they may have this question on their heart, and you'll be prepared. Okay, and you'll see this QR code here, which will be on the slide after the presentation. You can use your phone, look at this, and it'll take you to the actual web page where our calendar is for the fall semester. And you can also access all of our past presentations. Dr. DePoe, who is here, and Dr. Keltz, he's not here this evening, they've been so generous with their time and their wisdom to share this information with us. And that's it. I'd like to introduce to you Dr. John DePoe. I mean, you all know who he is. You were here last time. But let's give him a round of applause, everybody. Yeah. And John, the same thing, the virtual screen will be to your left. So you've just hover around the music stand. That's perfect.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody want to buy a vowel? Okay. All right. Thank you, John.
Yes. Let's start with a word of prayer. Lord, we pray for this time, ask for you to use it. May I speak well and recall how best that I understand this. And I pray that tonight you would help open up our eyes, equip us, and use what we have here for your glory. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Hey, John, may I remind people to ask questions at the end during our Q&A. There may be some big questions you have as he's talking about this, and he'll give some time afterwards to answer some questions. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So we picked tonight's topic. This is one of those things that often, it's one of these wonderful little sayings, right? It's often people bring this up. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And it kind of has like a nice little ring to it. It sounds really plausible. And it's often trotted out to just shut down Christian claims. And so I've thought a lot about this kind of claim. I feel like my background does uniquely prepare me to think about this. My training by background is largely in philosophy and epistemology in particular. I've taken graduate level courses on probabilistic reasoning, evidential justification, things like this. So, there are things that we can do with this question that I hope to show you tonight that goes a little bit further beyond just, gut feelings and intuitions, but we can actually demonstrate to some degree a lot, make some headway in really understanding how we should think about this question. Now, as we dig into this question, the first thing I wondered about is where did it come from? Where does this claim that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence come from? There is David Hume, who is somebody I'll be talking a lot about tonight, who put forward this claim, and the quote that I've got on top there says, "A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence." Doesn't that sound good? A wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. And so if you make an extraordinary claim, well, then proportionately you need extraordinary evidence. So maybe, once again, Hume, he's very pithy and often says things in a way that's very memorable. He's not the origin of the actual phrase, but maybe one of the originators of at least the idea. Carl Sagan, who is a 20th century popularizer of science, he is probably something along his lines is more of the original actual wording of this. And so he says, what counts is not what sounds plausible, not what we would like to believe, not what one or two witnesses claim, but only what is supported by hard evidence, rigorously and skeptically examined. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And so there is, at least in some presentations, this kind of plausible ring to this whole business, right? That there are reasons why, perhaps you don't believe in, or you might be skeptical that aliens, have visited Earth. Or there are reasons why we tend to cast, I think, reasonable doubt on certain kinds of extraordinary claims. And so what the skeptic often thinks he's doing is he's just extending the same commonsensical, plausible principles that you employ, but he's going to say, I just do it, though, towards religion. And since I'm doing it toward, you're just not being consistent in how you're doing it, is often how they intend it. Now, if you really try to nail down what a skeptic means, or what a critic might mean when they say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, you say, what really constitutes being an extraordinary claim? Or what would constitute being extraordinary evidence? I think that you'll find that many are not really prepared to explain that or to give that answer. So what I've decided to do is try to give, in my experience of interacting with different kinds of people with different beliefs, what have they meant? So here's one idea. That extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The extraordinary just means what is weird and what is unusual. There is, in quantum physics, this wonderful example, this experimental evidence that we have for something called quantum entanglement. Quantum entanglement is this idea that you can have two protons move in opposite directions at the speed of light. And they have a measurement that on these particles that's a spin. You can have an up spin or a down spin. So when you fire these protons and they go in opposite directions, when you measure the one over here, if it has an up spin, the other one necessarily must have a down spin. And if this one has a downspin, then the other one must absolutely have an upspin. But there's no way for them to causally interact with each other because they're moving at the speed of light apart from one another. That is really, really weird. It's incredibly unusual, and there's really no good explanations, or maybe I should say there's no widely accepted scientific explanations for why quantum entanglement happens. But do we really need extraordinary evidence to believe that it happens? All you need is confidence in the machinery that you use to measure the events that take place, and you can actually get evidence for the extraordinary. There are things that are really weird or unusual, but once again, all it takes for you to establish it might be really simple, like having the proper machinery and making sure it's calibrated right, and being able to read it clearly and record the information. Think about this with miracles. So with miracles, a lot of times the idea is put forward that you need to have extraordinary evidence because miracles are extraordinary things. Well, take, for instance, the resurrection of Jesus, or a resurrection. The evidence that you need for a resurrection actually doesn't have to be extraordinary. What do you need to prove a resurrection? Well, you need to have proof that this person was alive up to a certain time. You need to have evidence that at a certain time after that he died. And then you need to have evidence that he is alive, after being established to being dead. If you think about this, how much evidence does it take to believe someone is alive? It's actually pretty minimal evidence, right? Hopefully, as I walked into the church today, you didn't need a lot of evidence to believe I was alive. You immediately came to the belief that I was alive. It doesn't take a lot of evidence to believe someone is dead. Once again, you can establish that pretty easily. It's a pretty common event throughout the history of the world. Establishing somebody's death is pretty easy. And once again, establishing that somebody is alive at a later time is still a pretty low-level belief. What's extraordinary is not any of the evidence that's involved in that, but actually just the putting it all together amounts to something extraordinary. But once again, it doesn't really require any kind of extraordinary evidential feat on the part of the believer. It's pretty simple and straightforward. If you want to add a few, we can talk a little more about that kind of example, but that's one of the first things to realize is that we can actually establish a lot of unusual and weird things in a rather simple and straightforward way. Take another example would be, what would it take to believe that aliens landed? If aliens visited us, if you just stepped outside and a flying saucer came down in the parking lot and a little ramp came out of it and little green Martians marched down the ramp, that's really extraordinary, but the establishing of that is just a matter of seeing the right things at the right place at the right time. And in some respects, you might just say that's really not that extraordinary. So, once again, I think that skeptics are trying to use this more as a conversation stopper than really as a principle. Here's another way they might put it. Okay, not just what's weird, like quantum entanglement, but what is very, very improbable. This is what I mean by extraordinary. Extraordinary is that which is incredibly improbable. Now, we can actually, once again, establish highly, highly improbable things in a pretty straightforward way. Think about what it would mean to establish that somebody has won the Powerball lottery. Now, one of the estimates I looked at said that the probability of winning a Powerball lottery is 1 in 292.2 million chances. So this is the way David Hume, I think, kind of thinks about this proportioning of evidence. If something is radically improbable, then you need to have evidence that's just as radically improbable, that would need to be as radically probable or credible in proportion to the evidence. But once again, how do we establish somebody wins the lottery? You pick up a newspaper and you read the numbers from last night. Or you tune in and you watch the news and you see the numbers from as they get reported that night. Or maybe you have a friend who's really into the lottery, and you call up your friend or shoot him a text message and ask what were last night's numbers. And if the numbers came back as yours, then you've got good evidence that this happened. But you'll notice, is there anything really extraordinary? Is like a newspaper report or a news report online or a message from a friend who follows these things, is any of that really extraordinary evidence? It all sounds like, to me, very ordinary evidence to me. So, and I'll have a little more to say on how this works when it comes to overcoming these probabilities. There is in probability theory a reason why these things work. The numbers actually work out here. But what is going on with this is just to point out that you don't need to have, on the one hand, an improbable event of 1 in 292 million chance, followed by something that is so credible it must be right in a proportion of 292 to 1 or something. We can actually overcome those probabilities in another way. And it's because Hume was actually not well informed about probability calculus and how to make those kinds of judgments. And I like to beat up on Hume for this, and I'll have a lot more to do later tonight on this. But part of that's because the probability calculus was not developed in Hume's time, or it was being developed in Hume's time. And so there was actually a guy who wrote David Hume a letter about this. Charles Babbage, he wrote something called the Ninth Bridgewater Treatise. This is the same guy who's usually accredited with inventing computers. And Charles Babbage wrote David Hume and pointed out, actually with mathematical precision, what was wrong with Hume's views. And Hume kind of replied by saying, he just couldn't follow all that stuff. It was over his head. So, a little more on that later. Third option. Maybe what the skeptic means isn't what's really just weird or unusual. Maybe they don't just mean what's really, really improbable. What they mean is something even further out. They just say, look, anything outside of the laws of nature. They might say, look, there's something that's different from aliens landing or quantum entanglement or winning the lottery is that all that happens within the boundaries of the natural laws of nature. There's none of that that's quote-unquote supernatural. So what they would want to say is we just have to, what I mean by extraordinary claims would be anything that's outside of the laws of nature. Now that might sound like a good way to try to make their case only apply to where they want it to apply, but the problem would be if that is really what they meant, then it would be impossible to ever establish new laws of nature. The laws of nature that we've had in the past haven't always turned out to be the correct ones, and there's a pretty good chance that a lot of what we think about the scientific natural world today is going to be refuted in the near future and many times over. So if you say anything that falls outside of accepted science is going to count as extraordinary and thereby requiring some extraordinary evidence, well, then you might as well say that whatever science I believe today is the science we have to believe forever. Because what they've essentially said is if you show me anything outside of the science I've accepted, well, then I'm not going to believe it. But that's a pretty surefire way to ensure that we never get any progress in science. So, once again, I think that's probably not going to be, it's something that the skeptic usually himself doesn't want to accept. And of course, practically speaking, if you really do believe that we can discover new things in the scientific world that we have yet to observe or understand or that could supersede our previous understandings of these things, then you can't rule out the evidence for things just simply on the grounds that it's outside of what we call our natural understanding of things. So those are our three first attempts to do this. Here's a fourth one, and this is really where I think the skeptic wants to go with this, is that what they really mean by saying extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and you say, what do you mean by extraordinary? What they really mean is, well, just doggone it, anything I don't want to believe. I am just pulling out this phrase because don't want to listen to what you have to say about Jesus being raised from the dead, or a historical claim about Moses parting the Red Sea, or something like that. I really just don't want to hear the evidence you have to say. I don't want to, of course, say that this is what all atheists are doing, but there certainly is a stripe of a kind of stubborn-minded atheist that is doing this just to say, look, any claim I don't want to believe requires a standard of evidence that cannot practically ever be met. It's really, in my view, just a prejudice. It's a way to cover up your prejudice in fancy-sounding epistemic terms to sound like, you really just want to believe naturalism and you're not going to look at any evidence to the contrary. So let's look a little bit deeper. These are, once again, just some ways that we could think about what it means to say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I did want to get back to David Hume, because I think that he is the philosophical forefather to this kind of thinking. And if you read his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, he wrote in the 10th chapter, it's all dedicated to miracles. The title of the chapter is called On Miracles. Very famous chapter arguing against miracles. And Hume, you can read his argument. I've summarized it up on the screen here. I should also say this, that he gives two arguments against miracles. There's a part 1 and a part 2 to this chapter. We are looking at part 1. Part 1 is the argument that you might call as the in-principle argument against miracles. This is the one that basically says, if you look, you don't even have to look into the evidence for a miraculous claim, because we can dismiss the believability of a miracle without ever even considering its evidence. There's a part 2, which is then to say, now this is why all the evidence that's ever been put forward for miracles is bad evidence. We'll focus on the part 1, because this is really the one that most people talk about philosophically. It's the philosophically interesting one. And the argument goes like this. His first premise is this: a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. Second, the laws of nature uniformly and universally are confirmed by our past experience. Number 3, all reasonable judgments about matters of facts must rely on past experience, and therefore, on the basis of 1, 2, and 3, it follows that it is never reasonable to believe a miracle has occurred. So let me pick this apart just sort of claim by claim. Let's take a look at the first claim. Are miracles violations of the laws of nature? And the very first question I like to ask on this is, what is a law of nature? And a law of nature, I think of laws of nature as general descriptions of what happens in nature, the way that nature behaves without any interferences from agents. So if you let nature do its thing without any agent interfering, what we call the laws of nature generally describe how nature works. If you think about this, the laws of nature themselves do not do anything. The laws of nature are abstract generalizations. A law of nature is like a formula, and a formula doesn't ever do anything. A formula is at best, a description of reality, but it does not actually cause anything to happen. The law of nature itself is not a causal agent. When a fire, catches onto a branch of a tree, the law of nature does not do anything. What is doing things are the actual particles at hand. The particles that make up the fire, and the particles that make up the tree, and the particles that make up the air surrounding that, all of that is what is doing something. So when people talk about what the laws of nature do or don't do, what the laws of nature allow, they're almost elevating the laws of nature to a status that they don't belong to. They're trying to turn the laws of nature into some kind of causal agent, as if the laws of nature are like a policeman enforcing the laws of Lubbock. If a policeman sees somebody stealing something, we hope that he's going to interfere and stop the thief from doing their deed. But the law of nature, if the law of nature sees God doing something, it's not like the law of nature steps in and stops God doing from what he's doing. He's to enforce the laws of nature. The laws of nature, once again, are not agents. They don't do things. The laws of nature are our general ways of describing what nature does when people, when agents don't interact with it. So how could a miracle be a violation of a law of nature? And what I would argue, and I'll bring on some support from C.S. Lewis in one moment, is to say that the laws of nature, this idea that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature doesn't make sense. This is not the right way for us to think about laws of nature. So C.S. Lewis puts it this way. He says, "It is therefore inaccurate to define a miracle as something that breaks the laws of nature. It doesn't. If God annihilates or creates or deflects a unit of matter, he has created a new situation at that point. Immediately, all nature domiciles this new situation, makes it at home in her realm, adapts all other events to it. It finds itself conforming to all the laws. The divine art of miracle is not an art of suspending the pattern to which events conform, but of feeding new events into that pattern." So this is what C.S. Lewis is talking about, is that when, let's say, Moses parts the Red Sea, it's not as if suddenly all the laws of nature have been violated by the Red Sea being parted. What is happening is that God is acting as an agent locally in that place to actually move the sea just in accordance with the laws of nature, actually. That the very reason why God is even able to part the Red Sea is because there still are natural laws that are being at play. It's exactly what happens, except when an agent is interfering in the situation. We wouldn't call it, if I took an object and I drop it, what the laws of nature would say is it should fall to the ground at, the rate of gravity. If I drop it and I catch it in the middle, did I violate the laws of nature? It didn't keep falling. Well, my interfering with that situation and stopping the rock midway doesn't violate the laws of nature. It was just what an agent does when they stepped into that situation and stopped the rock from what it would have continued doing on its own had there been no agent there. The Red Sea, before Moses parts that, is just going to keep doing follow its course that it would continuously do if there was no agent interference. But if God chooses to interfere as an agent and kind of put his hand in the way and stop it, that's not a violation of the laws of nature. It's once again how an agent works with nature to bring about a new situation. It's God's version of catching the rock midway as it's falling. And so it's kind of a misnomer and I think loads up an argument against miracles in an unfair way to call miracles violations of the laws of nature. What we really should think of is that what miracles really are what happens when an agent, when a divine agent interferes in the natural order of things. Let's take a look at the second claim. So the second claim in Hume's argument is that the laws of nature are uniformly and universally confirmed by our past experiences. Now, the question to ask somebody who starts going down this Humean-style argument is to ask them, whose experiences are you talking about? Is it the experience of just one individual, your own? And if that's the case, then guess what? You don't have enough experiences to confirm all the laws of nature. That in your past experience, what has uniformly and universally been the case is actually not going to map on to what is regularly happening out in the world. If you've lived your whole life on the northern hemisphere, then every time you have flushed a toilet or pulled a plug on a drain in the sink, it has always drained going clockwise. But if you hear reports of some people who live south of the equator, and they tell you that when they flush their toilets or when they pull their drains, that it drains counterclockwise, do you think a miracle has happened? Should you dismiss every claim they've ever made because you've never experienced that? I think that is, once again, a little bit, that's too skeptical. That Hume, if he's right, has proven too much here. So if it's not just up to the one individual's experience, maybe you say, well, okay, I didn't mean what one person experienced. What I mean is all of humanity. What every human being, everywhere, at every place, every time, what we have collectively observed is going to give us the laws of nature. Okay, but if you now do that, then how do you exclude those people who have claimed that miracles have happened? Those who say that Jesus was raised from the dead, or that Moses parted the Red Sea. If we're going to appeal to all the people, then you can't exclude reports of miracles from your inclusion of everybody's experiences. So, once again, this may sound really nice. The laws of nature are uniformly and universally confirmed by our past experiences, but it turns out that you can't use that claim to say, therefore, there is no epistemic grounds whatsoever for miracles, because either you're going to narrow it so much that you're only down to your own experiences, but if you really broaden it to include more people, who's to exclude the experiences of those who think supernatural things have happened, or observed even supernatural things? There's another really interesting point that was made by William Paley and William Adams. These were British theologians who were contemporaries, or almost contemporaries, of Hume. I think Paley was really about 20 years later than Hume, but Adams, I think, was square right with David Hume. And by the way, Hume's essay that, this miracles essay, actually garnered a lot of criticism in his own time, some of which I think is very, very good. And it's one of those interesting things of history that people kept repeating Hume's argument because it was interesting and new, but all of the claims that refuted it and over again showed what was wrong just kept getting swept under the rug because it was the status quo. It was kind of what we already know about. But Adams was one of those. But here's the thing, is that if we want to conform what we believe to past experience, the question to ask yourself then is it the case that we have a past experience that would exclude miracles from happening? What I mean is this. So what Hume is basically saying, let's even grant him the premise, that what he's saying is this. Everybody has consistently, throughout all history and time, only observed natural things happening according to the laws of nature. But does that mean that he has observed that miracles do not happen? All that he has observed is an absence of the miraculous, but that is not the same thing as experiencing that miracles do not happen. To have an actual opposing experience would be something like this. Two people are at the tomb of Jesus, and they would have to observe two different contradictory things. One person would observe a Jesus raised from the dead, and another person would have to say, I was there at the same place, the same time, and I observed that he stayed in the grave. Those would be actual opposite and opposing experiences. But somebody who just generally has only seen things happen in accord with nature, and somebody who claims to have seen an exception to nature because God intervened in this specific place and time, those two things are actually in harmony with one another. The evidence for one does not count as evidence against the other. So once again, Hume really hasn't established his case. Even if we give him this premise, all it shows, at best, is that he and everyone else has never actually observed a miracle taking place, but that's not the same thing as saying that they have observed that miracles do not ever take place. So let me back up one more thing and just say that I had a third premise in Hume's argument, which I don't necessarily want to take issue with. We could take issue with it if we wanted to. But I think that once you pick apart the first and second premises the way I have, I would be perfectly fine with the third premise once we qualify the first and second ones this way. So once we accept that once we understand that this claim that the laws of nature are uniformly and universally confirmed by our past experiences is not as well established as Hume thinks, well, then I'm perfectly fine with the rest of it, with granting the third claim. So let me ask, what do we do, therefore, about extraordinary claims? As having gone through a little bit of the philosophy here with you, you might be saying, that's really great, but what am I supposed to do when I leave this place and encounter other people? How do I handle this issue? The first thing that I want to point out is that there is an important sort of in-house debate within Christians. And it's usually put in terms of the doctrine of either of cessationism or the continuing of miraculous acts. There are many Christians today who believe that the Bible teaches that there are no more miracles after the age of the apostles, that the apostles were the last ones to be given miraculous, to perform miraculous actions. I think that is a perfectly reasonable and good and biblical and sound way to think. So once again, I don't want to get in the middle of an in-house fight, but if people want to talk about, do miracles still happen today, that's going to be something that within Christianity, Christians should listen to one another and talk about that issue. There's a really interesting 2-volume book put out by a theologian named Craig Keener, and it's just called Miracles. And in that 2-volume book, he goes through some of those issues. He actually investigates evidence for miracle claims today and actually finds some striking evidence for some pretty extraordinary miracles that he believes has taken place within the past even 50 years. If you want to learn a little bit more about the evidence for current miracles, if that interests you, I would really encourage you to look at Craig Keener's work. What else should we think about? I think as Christians, suppose that you're looking into miraculous claims, whether ancient or current. I still think that we need to be shrewd, we need to be wise, we need to be discerning. The fact that we can come to believe extraordinary things without extraordinary evidence doesn't give us the freedom to be gullible or to be just very, very casual and almost irresponsible is the word I'm looking for. Irresponsible in how we believe things. So we still need to evaluate things. If somebody claims something miraculous took place, that's a pretty serious claim. We need to understand, is this person credible, or are they the kind of person that likes to tell tall tales? Is this somebody, do we know that somebody had first-hand witness of this? Or is this one of those stories that's kind of been passed around like Facebook or email so many times over, and we don't even know where it began from, or if this really had a genuine and sincere origin? We need to know the people that make these claims, that are the gateways to this evidence. If we're listening to their testimony, were these people that were qualified to make this judgment? Did they really know the person was ill beforehand and fully healed afterwards? Do they really know the facts of the case well enough to actually, what they tell you is accurate? These are all good things for us to be doing. And that's what I mean by this epistemic skill, that once again, is when we hear from people on these things, are they skilled enough to be able to report accurately both the before state and the after state that would need to establish a miracle? I think these are all reasonable guidelines, and I think that, once again, I think these can reasonably be met in various cases. So, a couple of pieces of practical advice for you. One is, when somebody trots out this claim and they're ready to kind of move on and just kind of move on to the next topic, ask them, what do you mean by extraordinary? You just said, I was just talking about the resurrection of Jesus, and you said, well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What do you mean by extraordinary? And get them to unpack that, and you're most likely going to see them fall into one of these traps of saying it's really, really improbable. It's a violation of the laws of nature. It's just weird and unusual. And once again, I hope some of the things I've said have equipped you on how to continue that conversation in a productive way. Two is ruling out supernatural events from the armchair is what I would call just gross prejudice, and it needs to be pointed out. That if somebody is just trotting out the extraordinary claims, requires extraordinary evidence just to shut down conversation and say, we'll have none of that, then it's worth pointing out that at that point, they believe that their claim should be based on evidence, but actually they're not basing their claim on evidence anymore. They're shutting their eyes to the evidence and instead just saying, well, I'm just committed to naturalism, so please stop giving me evidence to the contrary. And then, like I said from the last slide, number 3, you yourself, don't be gullible. Assess what the credibility and sincerity and the epistemic skill of those who testify to an extraordinary event. As Christians, I think that we do ourselves a disservice when we are gullible. So if we are the most credible and scrupulous believers about scientific and miraculous and historical claims, then when we engage with non-believers, they should be able to say, well, it's one thing, when my crazy friend over there believes these crazy things, but man, when John believes it, he's not the kind of person who's reckless and careless in his beliefs. And so when we practice being scrupulous, careful thinkers and modeling that to our friends, it gives us more credibility when we then say, I think there's really good evidence and reasons to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. Or that the Red Sea was parted. So don't be gullible. Be a model epistemic agent in all of your beliefs, not just with your religious ones. I want to take a little bit of time to tell you about this formal refutation of David Hume. I have here in my hands the book on the screen. The title of the book is called Hume's Abject Failure. This is not published by a small Christian press, or it's not self-published. The author is not a Christian. This book is published by Oxford University Press, which is the premier academic press in philosophy. This was published by, the author is John Earman. He is a distinguished professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and he himself is not a believer. He does not believe in God. He's not a Christian. And he wrote this book because he thought that Hume, well, I'm going to read you a little bit of what he had to say because it is really good. This is from the introduction. He says, "It is not simply that Hume's essay does not achieve its goals, but that his goals are ambiguous and confused. Most of Hume's considerations are unoriginal, warmed over versions of arguments that are found in the writings of predecessors and contemporaries, and the parts of miracles that set Hume apart do not stand up to scrutiny. Worse still, the essay reveals the weakness and the poverty of Hume's own account of induction and probabilistic reasoning," which is really what gets Earman upset because he's a philosopher of science. That stuff really bothers him. "And to cap it all off, the essay represents the kind of overreaching that gives philosophy a bad name. These charges will be detailed and supported below, but at the outset, I want to elaborate on the last one." And he goes on and says a few things about that. I want to also read a little bit of this. He says, in talking about Hume's argument, he says, "The temptation to fashion such an argument is understandable, but it also should be resisted. Any epistemology that does not allow for the possibility that evidence, whether from eyewitness testimony or from some other source, can establish the credibility of a UFO landing, a walking on water, or a resurrection, is inadequate. At the same time, of course, an adequate epistemology should deliver the conclusion that in most, maybe all actual cases, when all the evidence is weighed up, little credibility should be given to such events. Hume's account of inductive reasoning is incapable of satisfying these dual demands." So there you go. Buy the book and read it if you really want to find out more. It's one of the best treatments of Hume's work, and even only about half of it is John Earman, and the other half is all of these primary sources from Hume's time. He feels like they're getting such short shrift that he wanted to make sure they were printed with his book so that you could read the contemporaries of Hume that refuted Hume in his own time. So, a wonderful, wonderful book worth looking at if you want to get into some of those details about David Hume. Let me walk you through a little bit of this. Now, what I'm about to put up here might cause some of you to freeze up, and I just want you to take a deep breath and not panic. because I'm going to use some formulas and some expressions that look like mathematics. So, one of the ways that we have developed probabilistic thinking and weighing of probabilistic evidence is using what's called Bayes' theorem. So Bayes' theorem is a theorem of conditional probability. So if you look at the expression, what I have on the far left-hand side is, what that means is the probability of H given E. And what I mean by that is, like, what's the probability that H is true if E is true? And I used H and E because H means usually a hypothesis and E means evidence. So what's the probability that the hypothesis is true given some body of evidence? And that is equal to, and then I have two expressions there. One I underlined in blue and one I underlined in green. So on the blue, you get the probability of the intrinsic probability of the hypothesis. This is the probability of the hypothesis apart from the evidence, what it would be intrinsically. And you multiply that times the probability that you would have the evidence given the hypothesis was true. So that's like an expectation. What would be the likelihood that we would have this evidence if the hypothesis were correct? You take that number and you divide it by the green number. And the number in green is a larger expression that allows us to evaluate essentially what we'd call the probability of the evidence. And this is what was missing in a lot of these things that Hume was evaluating. Hume was not realizing the part of this that you see kind of on the bottom right-hand side, the right end of that green expression. So the left-hand side is exactly the same as what you have in the blue, and then the right-hand side after the plus is evaluating the probability, the intrinsic probability that the hypothesis didn't happen, and multiplying that times the probability you would have the exact same evidence if the hypothesis was false. So once again, before your eyes glaze over and you get too far off, what they mean is this. Why is it that we can watch a news report about the Powerball numbers and it can give us the evidence that we need to believe something that's one chance in 292 million? Because you don't just say, how probable is it that we would hear those numbers? You have to ask yourself, how probable is it I would hear exactly those numbers if they were the incorrect ones? And that was the part that Hume was missing. He was not thinking, he was just thinking about what's the chance I would have it if it was true. And that is part of the formula, but it's not the whole formula. The rest of the formula is then to consider what's the chances I would have that exact same evidence if it were false. What would be the chances, for instance, when it comes to Jesus' resurrection, that we would have all of the reports that he was raised from the dead by his closest disciples if, in fact, he remained dead in the tomb? What would be the chances of Jesus being raised from the dead if he in fact was dead, if he was dead, but the evidence would be like the way that the early church transformed a portion of Judaism in the first century? There are things that once again that you have to consider that have to do with having the exact same evidence even if the hypothesis itself were false. So one more step of this is then what you can do is you can take Bayes' theorem and you can compare two different hypotheses. And so one way that I do this is you have hypothesis 1 over hypothesis 2. And the last term in the expression is exactly the same, so those cancel out. That's why I have the x over that. And what you're left with is this comparison. So essentially, if you want to know hypothesis 1, Jesus rose from the dead, and then hypothesis 2 is, let's say, the disciples mistakenly reported Jesus rose from the dead. How would you compare that? Well, you'd first have to compare the intrinsic probability of Jesus being rising from the dead versus the disciples being mistaken. Now, I'll say this, which is that on those comparisons of just those two, I would say it's very likely it's more likely the disciples are mistaken than that Jesus rose from the dead. If that was the one and only factor, that would make it such we shouldn't believe Jesus rose from the dead. But we have to look at the other factor as well. And the other factor would say, what's the probability we would have all the evidence that we have for the resurrection, given that either the resurrection happened or given that the disciples were mistaken? And there, I would say it should be weighted much heavier in favor of the resurrection. And one more way to do this is to consider an additional feature of probabilistic reasoning, which is the idea that if there are multiple independent eyewitnesses, then they actually have an exponential effect on the evidence, on the hypothesis. So what I've done here is I've kept us with hypothesis 1 being the resurrection, hypothesis 2 being that the disciples were mistaken. What I have on the second line is I put in some placeholder numbers. These aren't meant to be precise and exact, but just a ballpark figure, let's say. And I've said that the probability of the resurrection compared to the probability of the disciples being mistaken is such that the disciples are in a ratio of 1 billion to 1, or is that 1 trillion to 1, more likely to be correct. And I think that's pretty generous, right? I'm spotting the view that Jesus rose from the dead at a disadvantage of 1 trillion to 1. The next factor that I have in the rounded parentheses there is going to say, then what would be the probability we would have the disciples' testimony, or a single disciple's testimony that Jesus rose from the dead, given either that the resurrection really happened or given that they were mistaken? Well, I think that it's really, really unlikely we would have their testimony that Jesus rose from the dead if they were mistaken. And so I think, very modestly only said that it's at a factor of 10 to 1 in favor of the resurrection. I think if we really argued about that number, it should be a lot higher. But then here's the other thing. Just going 10 to 1 and then saying there are 10 independent eyewitnesses who saw the resurrected Jesus, well, then that gives us now what I have on the right, which is then a 10 to 1 ratio in favor of the resurrection. And if you want to convert that into a percentage of probability, it's a 90.9% confirmed just on these kind of placeholder numbers. I'd say that's pretty good at establishing something like the resurrection. And this was one of the first research projects that I had gotten into, and one of my first publications was related to this topic. So if you're interested in the numbers, I can come back to this slide and talk through it a little more. But here's really the point to take away from this. We can argue all day about those numbers and what this should be more, this should be less. That's really not the point of this. The whole point of this is to say this. David Hume said, you can never get enough evidence to believe something miraculous took place. And what Bayes' theorem can show us is that as long as you don't say it's impossible for a miracle to take place, then you, in principle, should always be open to the possibility that with enough evidence, you could show it happened. And that is something that shows definitively that Hume is wrong. And in a way, this isn't exactly what Ehrman does, but this is in the same spirit. This is more or less what John Ehrman's getting at in his book here. That Hume is he's not onto something at all, he's just grossly and demonstrably mistaken about this. So, with that, I think this is a good time to close. I'll take questions that y'all have, see if there's anything further we can say about these extraordinary claims and whether we need extraordinary evidence.
All right. So for those who are watching online, please type your question in and I will read it. And anybody have any questions at all? Or stories? Have you encountered someone who may have asked you this question before? I had a question, but then I was fiddling with stuff and I forgot it. What are the chances I would have forgot the question?
Extraordinary.
They're pretty good. It's extraordinary. That's right. Let me see if I can remember it. Have you ever encountered anybody who used this objection on you? And
yeah. So
go ahead.
So as I mentioned, I studied this in graduate school, and I had done graduate school in philosophy at secular schools. One of them, Western Michigan, one at the University of Iowa. And I actually brought this argument. This was one of my first presentations also at the American Philosophical Association, the big society for professional philosophers. And so I was real excited to learn all this material and put it together into a paper and be able to present it. And one of my first audiences was other graduate students at Western Michigan University. And at the end of the presentation, one by one, they kept asking objections and kind of getting answered, okay, and this, that. And by the end, they were doubting the very axioms of logic and probability. That rather than say that maybe there's something here to your evidential claims about miracles, they were actually more interested in throwing out the very principles of reason itself to save themselves from having to believe in miracles.
Are you suggesting that some people can be so stubborn in their belief against supernatural events that they start to be hyper-skeptical?
That's right.
Something like that?
We can, and I think in a different way, Jesus was dealing with some of this in his own time, but not with naturalists, but with people that wanted to see Judaism in the Pharisaical way. And so when Jesus comes along and he does miracles in front of their very eyes, we do see some people respond in belief and faith, and their minds are changed. But you find there's actually a group of people that are even hardened harder against Jesus the more they see evidence of miracles for his new way of following the Lord. So it's just, once again, sometimes people can think they're being rational in the way they look at all these things, but sometimes based on their responses, you find out it's more of their heart condition comes out.
You know, you brought up the fact of believing that miracles happen doesn't mean that you should be gullible to believe every miracle claim. It makes me think a little bit of a poster you might see on a pastor's door that says, "Expect a miracle."
Mm-hmm.
So if miracles are rare, then should we expect them? You know, that's another question. Yeah. You know, if miracles do happen, should we expect to see them all around us?
So not in the sense that I mean the word. Sometimes we use the word miracle in a really loose way. So some people talk about how the birth of a child is a miracle. And I don't want to undermine that claim or to belittle it. But I would say in the way I'm using the word miracle, I don't just mean things like that, or like a sunrise is a miracle, or anything like that. I even think there's a difference in Christianity between what we might call a miracle versus God's providence. So I don't think it was miraculous that I met my wife when and where I met her, but I think it was providential. And there's a difference. So providence is when God uses the operations and workings of the natural world to accomplish his will. So I don't think God intervened supernaturally to have me meet my wife when and where I did. He just so arranged the natural unfolding of history and events so that I would meet her, and I'd say that was providence. But a miracle is when God alters, when he steps into the natural order of things, and his agency changes the course of events. I think that these are rare. Even in the Bible, sometimes people think, well, the Bible's just filled with miracles. If you think about this, miracles are actually pretty rare, even in the Bible. They cluster around just really a handful of people. They cluster around Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. There's maybe a few miracles that others perform here or there, but overall, miracles are actually not real common, even in the Bible. Miracles, accepting that they're not common, I think still should be a part of us. Like if just somebody reports, something miraculous, I think even as a believer, we're okay to be a little skeptical or to look for a little bit more evidence for some of those claims. Now, I will say that also as a believer, we do have more evidence for miracles than non-believers have. If you already believe that there is a God and that he does work miracles, then once again, we may have a better basis. And just sharing what we have with a non-believer, they might laugh at us, but we once again have a longer background and history with the Lord that they don't have. So take, for instance, if you have somebody who has a friend who has terminal cancer, and you and a group of friends have been praying for that individual to be healed, if there is an inexplicable healing that doctors cannot explain that takes place after these prayers have gone up, I'm not saying that proves it's a miracle, but as a believer, you have more basis for thinking a miraculous event took place than for a non-believer who might just say that it was an anomaly, an inexplicable event. Yeah, I think that we need to be careful in how we think about these things. I don't believe every miracle that's ever told to me. But at the same time, I'm kind of hopeful as well. I don't rule things out because I'm not like David Hume and just think, well, it's impossible to ever show those things ever took place.
Well, I thank you, John. I think the question that's on everyone's mind here is there going to be a test on that probabilistic formula? Yes.
We'll do that next month. I'll start with a quiz and see how you do. But no. Although I will say, if you really do learn this, there are certain people this goes a long way with, in terms of my friends who are mathematicians and engineers and doctors. Once again, some of the more science-minded folks. If you actually take the time to learn something technical, like Bayes' theorem, you actually may make a little more. I know they will be more inclined to look at a formula than to read a book. So once again, think about your audience. If you do have a very science and math-minded friend who is skeptical about miracles, you might see if they'll listen to a formula if they're not going to listen to your philosophy. And once again, even this little essay by Charles Babbage, who is the proto-founder of computers, who carries a lot of weight with our science and medical-minded people, that could actually open up some doors. Say, did you know he was a believer, and he believed that Jesus was raised from the dead, and he believed that probability calculus vindicated all that. So,
well, let's give John a round of applause. And John, could you go to the last slide?
Oh yeah, you got one more in here, don't you?
And you can use your phone to scan that QR code and access our calendar for the fall 2025, and to watch other videos with John presenting information, and also Kyle, who's our other presenter. So next month, was it September 17th, is How is the Bible put together? Yeah, how is the Bible? Does Christianity make sense? All right, thank you, and enjoy the coffee and cookies in the coffee area.